right, let's return to chapter 11. We've got a lot to talk about. In fact, we're going to talk about Egypt in this lecture, which is an important section of this chapter. Frankly, I can and have taught classes exclusively on portions of some of these lectures on Mesopotamia, on Egypt, and the Mediterranean. These are huge subjects, and this is going to be the case for the rest of the course. We're compressing a lot of information into a very short amount of time. So necessarily there will be some parts that are going to have to get left out. We could discuss this in a live session, or you can email me or message me about questions you have or topics you'd like to discuss. I find these subjects fun, of course. So with that in mind, let's look at the most important things that we need to talk about in terms of Egypt in terms of early state formation. We looked already at Egypt and North Africa in terms of the transition from hunting and gathering to farming and herding, and what we learned was that it actually was a lot wetter, and it was the desertification and the aridification of the area that transformed human behavior in this area. It was no longer possible to live out in the deserts, or what became the deserts. And the Egypt really became dominated by the one water source now, which was the Nile Valley, which flows from its headwaters in Ethiopia through Sudan and Egypt and their respective deserts to northwards to the Mediterranean Sea. And it being the waters being generated by seasonal monsoons, it behaves on very regular schedule, and annually it floods its banks, but it's in a very channeled valley, the Nile Valley, for most of its course, that those floodwaters flood and then they recede, and you can predict. You know when that's going to happen. Unlike the Tigris and the Euphrates that we saw in Iraq, where it was very erratic. They were fast-moving, powerful rivers on very flat, kind of endless plains, that all it took was a flood and suddenly the river could shift courses, and your city would, wherever you were living, could be damaged. But also you could find that from one year to the next you thought you were on the river, and now the river's a few miles away. So unpredictability meant that in Mesopotamia you needed to control those bodies, and you had to control those rivers. Whereas in Egypt, the water source was predictable, and it was the source of life. In fact, they called the Nile Valley the Black Land, meaning it was where the floodwaters came in and brought this very rich deposits, silty deposits that produced food and water, and life came out of the Nile Valley. Outside of the valley, they called it the Red Land. It was barren and dry and harsh and dangerous, and so the Nile Valley really came to be the homeland. But unlike a large area that expands outwards, that wasn't really possible in Egypt. It was a very linear, elongated land. So their territory was really defined by the river course. And so you see organization of identities and groups of people also arranged in a linear fashion. So you tend to think of territories as having like a breadth. They're sort of a round sort of a territory that you have boundaries in 3 dimensions. But frankly, it's really just 2. It's north and south. In Egypt, it's upriver and downriver. And so Upper Egypt is the southern part, up the river is to the south, and that has canyons and rapids and what are called cataracts, where you have steep drops in the river. These are now, a lot of them are dammed, or they have ways to get over these cataracts with boats and things. And but in the past, those weren't around there. In Lower Egypt or northern Egypt, the river fans out as a delta as it slows down and creates a large flat plain before it reaches the Mediterranean Sea. And that is just sort of dumping all of its deposits in a great big triangular shaped fan, which is very rich and lush and has lots of vegetation. So Upper Egypt, the south, is very narrow and channeled, and there are several cities that emerged in this area. And Abydos, Thebes, and Nekhen, for instance, in the early periods, and we'll see some other ones that come in the early dynastic period as well, the early kingdom, the old kingdom, I should say. And also there are some oases that are outside of the desert. There's the desert on either side, especially the western desert is vast and almost endless. But there's also some oases that run off from the Nile Valley. The Fayum Depression, in particular, is one that was sort of a lake that formed from some of the waters of the Nile that created a fairly large oasis in the desert. So this territory was protected on either side by deserts. If you wanted to get to Egypt, you either had to come sail from the Mediterranean, or you had to cross the desert, and that's tough. So these settlements along the Nile Valley were protected. They had their own identities. They had their own economies, and they were really only competing with one another. Who was upriver and who was downriver from you? In Lower Egypt in the north, right where the headwaters, or where the waters of the Nile fan out into the delta, you had sort of a fulcrum. You had a city that was formed in this early dynastic period that we'll look at, that was right at the separation between these two zones, between the delta that had one type of environment and the river valley that had another type of environment. This was Memphis, that was really right at the point that separated these two environmental zones. In addition to being predictable, these Nile floods also brought in nutrition from the highlands of Ethiopia and all along the river course that replenished the soil every year. So it wasn't really in danger of building up salinization as you had in Mesopotamia. You didn't need complex irrigation systems. You just let the river do its thing, and you worked around that. And so there were also, unlike Mesopotamia or southern Mesopotamia that doesn't really have any mineral resources, there's no gold, there's no precious stones or anything like that, copper sources. Actually, the deserts outside of Egypt have some precious minerals. So they were actually able to have access to some pretty important natural resources right on their doorstep, in addition to having the water and the agriculture locally as well. So a little bit different than Mesopotamia. I'll ask you to just look at the timeline of the chronology of ancient Egypt, and we're going to be focusing mainly on the pre-dynastic, early dynastic, and the Old Kingdom periods, which is the period of state formation. Now, when does state formation take place in Egypt? Well, you'll often hear that Mesopotamia was first and then Egypt, but that's probably not exactly true. I've mentioned this before, that these were part of the same super region, that there was probably knowledge, in fact there definitely was knowledge of each other. Even though Egypt was able to self-isolate a little bit, they were able to protect themselves and keep any potential threats at bay from outside. They were wrangling just amongst themselves of who was jockeying for who position for who was in charge in Egypt. But there is very clear evidence that they knew what was going on elsewhere, in Iran, in Iraq, what are today the countries of Iran and Iraq, and certainly in the land in Canaan, which is now Israel-Palestine area. Even as early as the pre-dynastic period. The succession of rulers is poorly understood because it was area by area. It was village by village that was becoming cities. And there were probably local rulers that were rising to power and also trying to gain power over one another. This is... We don't know a lot about these pre-dynastic periods in terms of like who was who, because writing was just being invented at this time, probably roughly contemporary with some of the first writing that we see in Mesopotamia, maybe slightly later. But I'm going to give a separate discussion on early scripts and writing, and that will maybe be a little bit helpful. One of the reasons why we know a little bit more, or we think we know a little bit more about the later periods, is because in 300 BC, a Greek writer named Manetho wrote about the Egyptian history. He compiled a history of Egypt, and he had created a king list. And he said the first pharaohs, and he went through and he had a list of the kings and the dynasties, and we still organize our information based on about ancient Egypt based on Manetho's writings. Now, was Manetho correct? Probably not. But this is sort of tradition in Egyptology and Egyptian archaeology that we use Manetho's terms. I think it's actually kind of a little bit backwards. We should be testing Manetho, and we do, to be fair. No one totally accepts Manetho's attributions, but it brings up the question, if he has a king list, he has a first king. And who is that first king of a unified Egypt? Because in the pre-dynastic period, we're talking about the little chieftains or petty kings, minor rulers of their own, of Saqqara, of Abydos, of Hierakonpolis, of Hierapolis, of Memphis, of who are the people that are in charge of these little cities. That's what we're looking at in the pre-dynastic period. And it appears as though kingdoms were starting to form in this late pre-dynastic period. But one indicator that we know from later Egyptian history is thought to be a representation, or actually presented as a representation of a unified Egypt. For much of Egyptian history was the crown. And there wasn't one crown of Egypt, there were two crowns. There was the crown of Upper Egypt and the crown of Lower Egypt. And these were of different types. One crown was a sort of a long, pointy hat, and the other one was sort of a flat, almost fez-like hat with some things coming, frills coming off of it, probably ostrich feathers. And there is the dual crown, which has both of these, the long pointy hat and the flat type of a hat, combined. So the dual crown of Egypt literally represents the unification of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. So if we see someone with you wearing the dual crown, or representing them, showing them with both crowns, then you might surmise that that person thought that they were the king of both Upper and Lower Egypt, meaning a unified Egypt. The first time we see this is Narmer. This is what we call the pharaoh Narmer, and it's a representation on a what's called a palette, and it was probably used for mixing eye paint to paint your eyes, which probably originally was to keep the dust out of your eyes, but it also made you look nice and purty. And so this palette has a little dish on one side for mixing your eye paints and applying them. And it's a very complex scene. I could talk your ears off about the Narmer palette. There's a lot going on here. Images of power, some of the earliest hieroglyphs that we know of, themes that we're going to see for the next 2,000 years. There's a lot going on in this. But also, very importantly, as I mentioned, that little bowl, if you look at the picture on the slideshow, is framed by two what are called serpopards. They're serpent-necked leopards. And that is a borrowed image. That is not Egyptian. That comes from probably Iran, from the area of Susa in the highlands of western Iran, a city that was emerging at this time, and or possibly through an intermediary through Mesopotamia. That's possible too. But in any case, Narmer, it has shown on one side wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, and on the other side showing the crown of Lower Egypt. And you can see that. So he doesn't have them together yet, but he is bringing them together. This is an expression by Narmer saying, I am king of both of these places. Also, I have friends in really important places over there in Iran and Iraq. Also, he has is depicted showing smiting his enemies, one of which is probably so-called Asiatic, which is probably from Canaan. So one of the closest neighboring regions. He has a mace, and he is smiting that opponent. So he is he's much larger than anybody else depicted. Also, his symbol, the Horus falcon, is also got putting some pressure on the Asiatics. His sandal bearer, so he's got servants, is depicted there. Also, there's a bunch of smaller people leading a procession where he's much taller than everybody, but they are all holding banners, and these banners are for the other city-states in Egypt. Now, Pharaoh, let's talk a little bit about this word. The word Pharaoh actually is Paro, which means great house. And so Egyptian society was really dominated by households and families and kinship. And so Pharaoh, or Pero, was the greatest of the great houses. And so the establishment of this dynasty was saying, my family is in charge now. And so this is Narmer's overt attempt to create symbols of his own power that then could be recognized by other people. Of course he's in charge. He's showing himself being in charge on these. Now, the divinity of the pharaoh, it's unclear exactly when the pharaoh became acknowledged to be a divine figure. This is a little bit unclear when that happened, but we know from later on periods that the pharaoh wasn't just the king, wasn't just the great house. It was linked to God on earth. This was a divine figure. It could be very early on, especially Narmer has this association with the Horus falcon. And this goes into Egyptian mythology that Osiris, the great god, it was killed by his brother. But Horus, his son, came to bring balance and judgment. That is to say, Ma'at. Balance and judgment in Egyptian is called Ma'at. And the Horus inhabits the soul or the body of the pharaoh. And when the pharaoh dies, they become Osiris. And so this is the same with Horus. So, and then Horus inhabits the next pharaoh, and that's passed on. And it's important in Egyptian mythology that the pharaoh is a divine figure because they're the ones holding back chaos. They're balance and judgment. They've got a job to do, and as we'll see in a moment. And also the pharaoh had a special relationship with another god, the sun god Ra. And this was extremely important because in addition to the waters of the river, the other thing that brings life, but also can bring death if you're not wise about it, is the sun. So like I said, I'll talk a little bit about Egyptian writing later on. And scribes and things like that, and it's very important. But I'll discuss this in a separate place. Another way that the pharaoh's divinity and power, both secular as a ruler, but also as a divine figure, were displayed, were